never forget the sound of footsteps that shouldn't be there. That hollow crunch of leaves when you're supposed to be alone. I've hiked thousands of miles on the Appalachian Trail, but what happened during those 6 days in late September changed how I feel about solo hiking forever. It started at Dix Creek Gap Shelter in Georgia. I'd been making good time that day, covering 20 miles before the sun started sinking behind the ridgeline. The shelter was empty when I arrived, which wasn't unusual for a weekday in shoulder season. What caught my eye was a pair of boots, men's Salomon X Ultra 4s, size 11, placed neatly at the shelter's entrance. They were quality boots, barely broken in, with fresh red laces that stood out against the dark leather. I figured their owner was gathering water or maybe answering nature's call. I set up my sleeping bag and started boiling water for dinner, but nobody showed up. As darkness fell, I made a note in the shelter log. September 23rd, found boots at shelter. Will report to next ridge runner. Mark, the temperature dropped that night, and I slept fitfully, dreaming of footsteps in the leaves. When first light crept through the shelter gaps, the boots were gone. I chalked it up to their owner returning late and leaving early. Not everyone follows shelter etiquette about greeting fellow hikers. But then I saw them again at Plummer Gap Shelter the next evening. Same boots, same red laces, placed at the entrance with military precision. This time they were turned toward the shelter, like they were watching me. The soles were clean, despite the muddy trail conditions we'd had all day. I checked the shelter log. No mentions of lost boots. No entries about their owner. My hand shook slightly as I wrote. 9/24, same boots from Dix Creek here. No sign of owner. Strange. Marked that night, I wedged a few small twigs between the boots, trying to prove to myself whether they moved. Sleep didn't come easily. Every snapping branch sent my heart racing. Around 2 a.m., something heavy moved through the underbrush behind the shelter. When I shined my headlamp, nothing was there. Come morning, the boots had shifted 45 degrees, now pointing toward the trail. The twigs lay scattered. This pattern continued for the next 3 days. Each shelter, the same boots would be waiting. At Carter Gap, they were toe-to-heel instead of side-by-side. At Big Spring Shelter, they were upside down. At Rock Gap, one boot was inside the other. Each morning they'd be gone, no tracks leading to or from them. I started hiking faster, pushing myself harder than usual. I skipped breaks, ignored the burning in my calves. Other hikers were few and far between this time of year, but I finally ran into someone at Wallace Gap on day 5. Her name was Sarah, a southbounder who'd started in Maine 4 months ago. "You're the first person I've seen in 2 days," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Haven't noticed anyone else's boots at the shelters, have you?" She took a long drink from her water bottle before answering. "Funny you should ask. I lost my partner's boots about a week ago. Brand new Salomons with red laces. He had to bail on the hike because of it. Got some nasty blisters trying to hike in his camp shoes. We filed a report with the Ridge Runner, but I figured they were gone for good. The energy bar I'd been eating turned to ash in my mouth. When exactly did you lose them? Must have been the 22nd. Right before Dix Creek Gap. They were hanging on his pack, then just vanished during a break. Why? Have you seen them?" I didn't sleep in a shelter that night. I made camp on a ridge, well off trail, setting up my tent on a bed of pine needles. As the sun set, I heard it, rhythmic crunching in the leaves, circling my position. The footsteps were barefoot, slow and deliberate. They continued until dawn. When I packed up, I found them. The boots were placed perfectly at the edge of my camp, red laces gleaming in the morning light. They pointed toward me, filled with fresh pine needles from the ridge where no pine trees grew. I took pictures, documented everything, and reported it all to the Forest Service. They searched the area but found nothing. The boots were never seen again after that morning, at least not by me. But sometimes, when I'm on trail and the wind dies down, I hear barefoot steps in the leaves. And I know someone's out there watching, waiting to set down their boots at the next shelter. Sarah messaged me a month later. The boots her partner lost? They were size 9, not 11, and they had yellow laces, not red. I still hike the app, but never alone and never in September. Some say the trail provides what hikers need, but sometimes I think it also attracts those who take what hikers have: their gear, their security, their solitude. I check every shelter log now, looking for mentions of boots left behind. So far, no new reports. But through hikers know the truth. We're never really alone out there. The footsteps in the leaves remind us of that. And if you're hiking the southern section and find a pair of Salomons with red laces, leave them where they lie. Their owner will return for them eventually. They always do. They say hunger is the best sauce, but out here on the Appalachian Trail, hunger can also be what keeps you alive. I learned that during my spring through hike, when something started stealing food from hikers near the Tennessee-North Carolina border. What I didn't expect was discovering just how calculated desperation could be. The first time it happened, I blamed myself for a sloppy bear hang. My food bag was on the ground at dawn, torn open with surgical precision. Only my protein bars and dried jerky were missing, the heaviest calories in the lightest package. The rest of my food was scattered but untouched. No claw marks, no crushed containers, none of the usual signs of a bear raid. Rookie mistake, I told myself, even though I'd been hanging food bags since I was a Boy Scout. That night, I doubled my precautions, used a new length of paracord, picked a better branch, and even set up my trail cam, a luxury item I'd been carrying to document my through hike. The weather was perfect, clear skies and a quarter moon. At exactly 3:17 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert. The footage showed my food bag dropping straight down, as if the branch had been cut. But the branch was intact in the morning. This time, only the protein bars were taken. Everything else was neatly repacked. Word spread quickly among hikers. At least 6 others reported similar incidents over the past week, all within a 20-mile radius. Always at night, always targeting high-calorie foods, always with minimal damage to other supplies. One hiker swore she woke up during the raid but couldn't move, said she felt drugged. The rangers blamed it on sleep paralysis. I started asking around at hostels and trail towns. An old-timer at mountain crossings gave me a knowing look. Had the same thing happen back in '82, he said, wiping down the counter. Whole string of food raids, precise as clockwork. They never caught who did it, but finds like that don't just stop on their own. Someone or something got hungry enough to risk it. That night, I set up camp early near Tricorner Knob Shelter. Instead of hanging my food bag, I filled it with rocks and rigged it with a small bell. My real food stayed in my tent against all conventional wisdom. The trail cam was hidden in a nearby rhododendron, and I settled in to wait. 3:15 a.m. The woods were dead silent. No owls, no wind, nothing. Even the spring peepers had gone quiet. My phone screen glowed. 3:16. I held my breath. 3:17. A shadow detached itself from the tree lean. The figure moved with practiced efficiency, heading straight for my decoy bag. They wore dark clothing and what looked like a retired military-grade night vision monocle. Their movements were smooth, deliberate, like they'd done this hundreds of times. The bell tinkled as they cut the rope. When the bag hit the ground and rocks spilled out, they didn't flee. Instead, they stood perfectly still, head cocked to one side. Then they turned and looked directly at my tent. "I know you're awake," a hoarse voice called out. "You're the first one to try rocks." They sounded almost amused. My heart hammered against my ribs. Why protein bars? I heard myself ask. Longest shelf life. Best calories to weight ratio. Easiest to store. They took a step closer. You learn these things, living out here long enough. How long? A bitter laugh. Since Afghanistan. The mountains here, they're different, but they feel the same. Easier to stay here than go back. Easier to take what I need than ask for help. Another step. Your camera's in the rhododendron. Good placement, bad angle. I swallowed hard. There are programs for veterans. People who want to help. Help comes with questions. Questions come with paperwork. Paperwork means going back. They were close enough now that I could see the outline of a beard through their neck gaiter. I don't take more than I need. 1 week's worth at a time. I leave the rest. The other hikers sleep aid in their water. Harmless, just insurance. They wake up tired, blame the trail. They step back. You should move camps tomorrow. Weather's turning bad up high. Why tell me all this? They were quiet for a moment, because you thought like me. The rocks, the camera, staying awake. Most people just hang their bags and hope. They turn to leave. Don't follow. Don't report. I'm not the only one who chose the woods over going back. I watched them melt back into the forest. My phone showed 3:24 a.m. 7 minutes. That's all it had taken. The next morning, I found a protein bar placed carefully at my tent door. Some kind of exchange for the rocks, I guessed. I never saw them again, but for the rest of my through hike, I noticed things. The way certain trail markers had tiny symbols scratched into them. How some shelter logs had entries that mentioned food raids, but never reported them to rangers. The occasional MRE wrapper, carefully buried but recent. Sometimes, on clear nights when I can't sleep, I think about that figure in the dark, about how the mountains can become a refuge or a prison, depending on what you're carrying inside. The trail provides, they say, but sometimes it provides by taking from others. I still do trail magic when I can, leaving boxes of protein bars at shelters. They always disappear around 3:17 a.m. I tell myself it's helping someone who needs it more than me. But I also leave notes with VA outreach numbers, addiction hotlines, PTSD resources. Maybe one day, they'll take those too. The rangers eventually added more bear boxes, stepped up patrols. The raid stopped, or at least moved elsewhere. But through hikers still whisper about food bags being cut down in the night, about the 317 visitor who takes only what they need, and sometimes leaves warnings about bad weather or washed-out trails in return. Some say there's more than one now. Others insist it's just bears getting smarter. But I know what I saw that night, and sometimes when I'm hiking alone, I feel eyes watching from the tree lean. I don't hang my food bags anymore. I leave them by my tent with a protein bar on top, an offering of sorts. Because out here, hunger isn't just about food. Sometimes it's about needing something you can't name, finding a way to survive when the world below the tree lean becomes too much to bear. And sometimes, the most human thing we can do is look the other way, leave a little extra food, and hope that one day they'll find their way back. 3 things matter when lightning hits the Appalachian Trail: timing, terrain, and luck. We had none of them the night we found the cabin. Hannah said we should have checked the weather before leaving Hot Springs, but spring storms are unpredictable in the Smokies. What started as distant thunder became a fight for survival that taught us why some shelters don't appear on trail maps. The first bolt hit when we were halfway up Snowbird Mountain. The crack was so close it left my ears ringing, and the ozone smell burned my nostrils. Hannah grabbed my arm, her face pale beneath her rain hood. "Matt, we need to get off this ridge," she shouted over the wind. The next lightning strike answered for me, splitting a birch tree 30 yards ahead. We backtracked, scrambling down the muddy slope as quarter-sized hail pelted our packs. That's when we saw it. A dark shape through the trees, too square to be natural. An old cabin, its tin roof gleaming dully in the storm light. Not a trail shelter, but a real cabin with walls and a door and, most importantly, no metal components reaching into the sky. "This can't be right," Hannah said, pulling out her phone. "There's nothing marked here on Far Out or any of my maps." Another lightning strike made the decision for us. We sprinted for the cabin's covered porch just as the sky cracked open. The door wasn't locked. It swung inward with an eerily well-oiled silence. The interior was a single room, maybe 15 by 20 feet. A pot-bellied stove sat cold in one corner. 2 sets of bunk beds lined the walls, their mattresses looking surprisingly clean. A wooden table held what appeared to be recent trail logs, and my stomach tightened. An open bag of beef jerky that couldn't be more than a day old. "Someone's staying here," Hannah whispered, though the thunder made whispering pointless. She was right. Besides the jerky, there were fresh supplies stacked neatly on shelves: batteries, protein bars, first aid kits. A solar charger sat in the window. Everything a hiker might need. I tried checking all trails on my phone, but the signal had disappeared. Hannah's phone showed the same, no service, despite having full bars 10 minutes ago. Even our GPS devices were dead, their screens black and unresponsive. "Look at this," Hannah called from the table. She was flipping through one of the trail logs. "These entries, they're from hikers I've heard about. Remember that group that went missing last spring? The ones they never found." I looked over her shoulder. The handwriting was clear, dated April 15th, 23. "Storm came out of nowhere. Found this cabin just in time. No signal but safe and dry. Tyler Manning and Group 4. "That's impossible," I said, recognizing the name from the news reports. "They disappeared 50 miles north of here." Hannah kept reading. More entries. More names we recognized from missing hiker reports spanning years. All describing the same thing: sudden storm, lucky find, no signal. The final entry was dated yesterday: "Don't stay after dark." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Outside, the storm intensified, but the sound was wrong, muffled, like we were underwater. The window that had shown gray skies moments ago now showed only black, though my watch said it was barely 4 p.m. "We need to leave," Hannah said, but when she pulled the door, it didn't budge. I threw my weight against it. Nothing. The window wouldn't open either, and when I tried to break it, my trekking pole bounced off like it was hitting rubber. That's when we heard the footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. Not the sound of someone seeking shelter. The door handle turned slowly, though we tried that same handle seconds ago. We backed against the far wall. The door swung open, revealing darkness deeper than the storm should allow. A figure stood there, or figures. It was hard to tell. The shape seemed to shift and flow, like smoke but darker. Hannah's headlamp flickered on. The beam caught something that made my brain stutter. Too many limbs, moving wrong. But it was the faces I remember most. Faces I recognized from missing hiker photos, but wrong, twisted, their eyes reflecting the light like animals. I'd like to say we fought, that we had some clever plan. But the truth is, when that thing reached for us with hands that kept multiplying, we ran. Somehow the door was open behind us, and we burst into the storm. We ran through darkness and lightning until our lungs burned, never looking back. Dawn found us 5 miles south, huddled under a trail shelter. Our phones worked again, showing dozens of missed calls from the search and rescue team that had been looking for us all night. According to them, we'd vanished from the trail for 18 hours, though it felt like minutes. The Rangers found nothing when they searched. No cabin, no footprints except where we'd emerged onto the trail. Just an old foundation stone they said had been there since the 40s. They took our report, exchanged looks we pretended not to see, and probably filed it away with all the others. But here's the thing about the Appalachian Trail. It keeps its own history. Months later, at a hostel in Virginia, we met a ridge runner who didn't dismiss our story. She showed us a folder of similar reports dating back decades. Always the same: sudden storm, mysterious cabin, missing hikers. The mountains have their own rules, she told us. Some shelters exist to save hikers. Others exist for different reasons. We finished our through hike, but we changed our habits. No hiking in storms, no matter how close the next shelter is. No entering unmarked structures. And most importantly, no assuming that every bit of trail magic is meant to help. I still hike, but I carry paper maps now. Sometimes they show things the apps don't: old trails, abandoned structures, places marked with warnings in faded ink. And sometimes, when storms roll in sudden and dark, I swear I can hear a door creaking open, inviting weary hikers to step inside. Hannah quit hiking after that day. She said the trail showed her something she can't unsee. But she keeps tracking missing hiker reports, marking them on a map. They form a pattern, she says, centering on places where old cabins used to stand. The beef jerky bag from that day is still in my pack. I keep it to remind myself that not all trail magic is good magic, that some shelters exist on maps for a reason, and others don't appear on maps for an even better reason. If you're ever on the trail and a storm hits, count the shelters you pass. If you find one that's not on your map, that looks too clean, too perfect, keep walking. The storm might soak you, the lightning might frighten you, but at least you'll be counted among the living when the sun rises. When I started photographing every shelter on the Appalachian Trail, I never expected to capture something that wasn't supposed to be there. As a professional photographer, I've learned that the lens sometimes sees things our eyes miss. But what my camera recorded during those 3 weeks in April made me question everything I knew about being alone in the wilderness. The project seemed simple enough. Document all 250-plus shelters for a trail conservation book. My editor wanted moody dawn shots, golden hour captures, the kind of images that make people want to protect these historic structures. I started in Georgia, working my way north with the spring. The first week went perfectly. My routine was clockwork. Hike to a shelter, set up compositions, shoot through the day to catch different lights, sleep there, catch dawn, move to the next. The solitude felt meditative. I'd wake up, check my shots from the day before, plan the next shelter. I noticed at first at Low Gap Shelter, something dark in the tree behind the structure, barely visible in the morning fog. I assumed it was a shadow, maybe a dead tree. But when I zoomed in during editing, my skin went cold. The shape was humanoid, just standing there, watching the shelter. I deleted the photo, blaming weird lighting and an overactive imagination. The next shelter was Blue Mountain. Different angle, different time of day, but there was again a dark figure closer this time. I could make out what looked like clothes, darker than the shadows around it. This photo showed it standing between 2 trees, maybe 40 yards from the shelter. I started obsessively checking every frame, comparing timestamps. The figure appeared in one photo from each shelter, always in the background, always slightly closer. Never in the first shots, always in the later ones, like it was slowly approaching while I worked. At Whitley Gap Shelter, I could see details. It wore dark hiking gear, modern cuts but filthy. The face was always in shadow, no matter the lighting. This time it stood at the edge of my composition, maybe 20 yards out. I started sleeping with my knife unfolded. I called my editor, trying to sound casual. "Hey, just wondering if anyone else has photographed these shelters recently. Maybe still out there shooting." "You're the first this season," she said. "Most photographers wait for fall colors." "Why?" I couldn't tell her. Couldn't explain that something was following me, getting closer, showing up in photos but never in person. She'd think I was losing it. Maybe I was. That night at Chattahoochee Gap Shelter, I set up motion sensors around my tent. Nothing triggered them, but the morning's photos showed the figure standing 10 yards behind where I'd slept. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle. I could almost make out hands now, too long for its arms. I started hiking faster, spending less time at each shelter. Didn't matter. Every photo set had one frame with the figure, each time closer. At Poplar Gap, it stood in the shelter doorway. At Deep Gap, it was inside, barely visible in the shadows. I couldn't delete the photos fast enough. The rangers I reported it to were sympathetic, but unhelpful. They checked the shelters, found nothing, suggested maybe it was other hikers or tricks of light. But hikers don't appear in the same clothes at every shelter. Light doesn't follow you for 100 miles. I almost quit the project. Should have. But I needed these shots, needed the work. So I pushed on, watching my photos with growing dread each morning. The figure never appeared in photos with other hikers around. Only when I was alone, at Waya's shelter, I decided to face it, set up my camera on time-lapse, one shot every minute through the night. I sat there with my headlamp on, watching the tree lean. Nothing. But when I checked the photos at dawn, there it was, standing directly behind me in every frame after midnight. In some shots, it looked like its hand was reaching for my shoulder. I couldn't sleep after that. Stayed at hostels when I could. Took shelter photos only at high noon with other people around. But the photos still caught it. Behind groups of hikers who swore they were alone, in windows that should have shown only empty rooms, always staring at me behind its shadow face. The breaking point came at Siler Bald Shelter. I'd been shooting since sunrise, no sign of the figure in any frame. As the sun set, I decided to check one last shot. Through my viewfinder, I saw it standing in the center of the shelter, facing my lens. When I lowered my camera, the shelter was empty. But when I raised it again, there it stood. I, through my camera, heard it shatter against the shelter wall. Grabbed my pack and ran down the trail in the dark. Didn't stop until I reached Franklin, North Carolina. Bought a bus ticket south the next morning. My editor was furious when I quit. The photos I'd managed to send her were stunning, she said, especially the ones with the artistic shadow figures in the background. Asked if I'd used digital effects. When I told her I hadn't, she got quiet. Said she'd pay kill fees if I sent over all the raw files. I never did. Couldn't bear to look at them again. But she published them anyway. The early ones, before the figure got too clear. They're in trail guides now. Sometimes, hikers post online about seeing similar shadows in their shelter photos. Always in the background. Always getting closer. I switched to wedding photography after that. Bright lights, lots of people. No shadows deep enough to hide in. But sometimes, when I'm editing reception photos, I find myself checking the backgrounds, looking for a dark figure in outdated hiking gear, head tilted wrong, hands too long. I keep the broken camera. Every few months, I think about getting the memory card recovered, seeing those final photos from Siler Bald, finding out what the figure's face really looked like in that last shot. But some things are better left unseen. If you're photographing shelters on the at, check your photos carefully. If you see something in the background, something that gets closer with each frame, delete them all. Switch to your phone camera. Better yet, stop taking photos entirely. Because sometimes the lens captures more than light. Sometimes it catches things that follow you home, things that wait in the background of every photo you'll ever take, getting closer frame by frame, until one day you look through your viewfinder and realize too late that there's no more background left for them to hide in. The worst things on the Appalachian Trail don't announce themselves with growls or footsteps. They wait in the quiet moments, in the fog that rolls down from the mountains when you're too far from any shelter to turn back. I learned this the hard way when I found that campsite, with its still warm ashes and the journal that should never have been there. The morning started clear enough. I'd been making good time through the Virginia section, averaging 20 miles a day. But mountain weather changes fast, and by mid-morning, the fog had rolled in thick enough to make the blazes disappear. 1 minute, I was following white marks on trees. The next, I was standing in a soup of gray. The smart move would have been to wait it out. That's what my trail guide suggested, what everyone tells you to do. But I had a food pickup scheduled in Damascus, and sometimes pride makes you do stupid things. I figured if I kept the ridge on my right, I couldn't go too far wrong. 3 hours later, I knew I'd made a mistake. The ridge had split, or maybe I'd crossed over it without realizing. My GPS showed nothing but blank space. No trail markers, no topographic lines, just digital static. Even my compass was acting weird, the needle spinning lazy circles like it was drunk. That's when I smelled the smoke. Not strong enough to be a forest fire, but distinct, someone's campfire recently burning. I followed my nose off what I thought was a trail and into a small clearing. A campsite materialized out of the fog, well used but not officially marked on any maps I'd seen. The fire pit held gray ashes with a core still warm enough to make my hand tingle. Whoever had been here left in a hurry. Their tent was still half-staked, a sleeping bag spilling out the door. A camp stove lay on its side, coffee grounds scattered around it like someone had knocked it over while running. "Hello." My voice sounded muffled in the fog. No answer. A logbook caught my eye, one of those cheap composition notebooks hikers sometimes leave at unofficial sites. It was propped against a log, its pages fluttering in a breeze I couldn't feel. The last entry was today's date. 10/15. They're following again. Third day now. Always just out of sight in the fog. Took different trails, doubled back. Doesn't matter. They match our pace, getting closer each night. We can hear them talking sometimes, but the voices sound wrong, like they're coming from too high up. Lost Mary's pack this morning. Just disappeared from where she'd hung it. Found it an hour later. Gone through methodically, everything searched. They're looking for something. Getting hard to think straight. Haven't slept more than an hour at a time since they started following. Chris swears he saw one of them last night. Said it was tall, too tall and thin. Said it moved wrong. We're going to make a run for the next shelter. If anyone finds this, stay on the marked trails. The fog isn't natural. They use it to hunt. The writing deteriorated after that, becoming frantic scribbles. A final line stretched across the page. They're here. Something cracked in the woods behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, but the fog had thickened. I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. Another crack, closer this time, like something stepping on dead branches. But the sound came from above, much higher than it should have. I stuffed the journal in my pack and grabbed the tent's rainfly. Bright blue, practically new. The name Mary was written in Sharpie near the zipper. More sounds now, circling the clearing. Multiple sets of footsteps. The rhythm was wrong, too spread out, like something with a stride twice as long as it should be. A voice drifted through the fog. "Did you find it?" The words were clear but distorted, like someone talking through water. Another voice answered from the opposite direction. "Not yet." But they left another one. The voices had no echo, no direction. They just existed everywhere and nowhere. I ran, not toward the sound, not away from it, just along the flattest ground I could find. Branches whipped my face. My pack caught on something. Fingers? But I yanked it free. The voices followed, having a conversation I could only catch pieces of. Always running. Never bring what we need. Getting closer, though. Next fog will be better. I ran until my lungs burned, until the voices faded, until I crashed into a trail sign hard enough to bruise my ribs. Damascus, 5 miles. Somehow I'd found my way back to the the fog thin enough to see the white blazes again, and I followed them like a lifeline. The rangers at Damascus took my report, documented the GPS coordinates I'd marked when I found signal again. They sent a team up but found nothing. No campsite, no fire pit, no sign anyone had been there. Just an old overgrown logging road and some scattered trash. But they kept the journal. Said they had a file of similar reports stretching back decades. Stories of fog that moves against the wind. Of voices that talk about hunting. Of hikers who disappear and turn up miles away with no memory of how they got there. I showed them a photo of the tent rainfly I'd grabbed. They logged it as evidence and told me they'd contact Mary's family. 3 days later, they called to tell me there was no missing hiker named Mary. No one had reported a blue tent missing. The rainfly I brought back was gray, not blue, and had no name written on it. I still hike, but never alone now. And when the fog rolls in, I make camp immediately, no matter the time of day. Sometimes, on the edge of sleep, I hear those voices in the distance, having their endless conversation about finding something, about using the fog to hunt. The journal is still out there. The rangers say it disappeared from their evidence locker a week after I brought it in. Every few months, another hiker reports finding it, always with new entries, always with the same warnings about staying on marked trails, always with stories about being followed through the fog. Some say it's just trail legends, stories we tell to keep hikers from wandering off path. But I know what I heard in that fog. I know what reached for my pack with two long fingers. And sometimes, when the weather turns gray and hikers go missing, I wonder if they found what they were looking for, those voices in the fog. I kept one page from the journal, torn out before I handed it over. The last lines haunt me. They're not following us anymore. They're herding us. And sooner or later, they'll herd someone to wherever they need them to go. If you're on the trail and the fog rolls in thick, don't try to push through. Don't follow the smell of campfire. And if you hear voices talking about hunting, about finding something they need, run. Run toward the sun, if you can see it. Run toward civilization. Just don't look up as you run. You don't want to see what makes those footsteps that sound too high, too wrong, too hungry. It's funny how the smallest details can save your life on the Appalachian Trail. A misplaced step, a forgotten water filter, or, in my case, noticing which leg someone limps with. They say the trail provides, but sometimes what it provides are warnings, if you're paying attention. I was 2 months into my northbound through hike when I met him. Most hikers had already spread out by then, leaving long stretches of solitude between shelters. The late April rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, turning the trail into a muddy river and my mood darker than the clouds. That's when I saw him sitting on a fallen log, his right leg stretched out awkwardly. He had good gear, Osprey pack, Arc'teryx rain shell, the kind of setup that said he knew what he was doing. His beard was well trimmed for a through hiker, but I figured maybe he'd started recently. "You okay?" I called out, already reaching for my first aid kit. Trail Etiquette 101. You always help another hiker. He looked up, squinting through the rain, twisted my ankle about a mile back, trying to make it to the next shelter, but he gestured at his leg with a grimace. I introduced myself, trail name Shutterbug, real name Alex. He said his name was Mike, no trail name yet. Said he'd started at Springer Mountain 3 weeks ago. Everything about him seemed normal, exactly what you'd expect from a hiker in trouble. "I can help you to the shelter," I offered. "Should be about 3 miles ahead." I'd been doing 20-mile days easily, so supporting someone for 3 miles seemed doable. He accepted gratefully, leaning on my shoulder as he stood. His limp was pronounced but smooth, practiced almost. I noticed he'd packed his gear perfectly despite his injury. Everything waterproofed, nothing dangling. We started walking, him limping heavily on his right leg. The conversation flowed easily. Where we were from, why we were hiking, normal trail talk. He knew his stuff, rattling off gear weights and trail stats like a pro. An hour in, I noticed the first discrepancy. As we crossed a particularly muddy section, he unconsciously shifted his weight to his bad right leg to test the ground. When he saw me watching, he quickly switched back to limping. Then came the stories. His starting date changed first 3 weeks ago, then a month, then back to 3 weeks. He talked about trail sections I knew he couldn't have hit if he'd started when he claimed. Small details, but they started adding up. "Must be tough hiking alone," he said casually. "Especially this section. Not many people through here lately." Something in his tone made my skin crawl. I remembered the warning posted at the last shelter about hikers reporting missing gear, how the thefts always happened in remote sections, how a helpful stranger had been mentioned more than once. My hiking partner's just behind me, I lied. She's bringing up the rear today. Should catch up any minute. His stride hitched slightly. Now he was limping on his left leg. Funny, he said, voice different. You didn't mention a partner earlier. The rain intensified, drumming against my hood. We were at least 2 miles from the nearest shelter in either direction. My satellite beacon was in my pack's top pocket, but I'd have to take off my right shoulder strap to reach it. She doesn't like hiking in the rain, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Usually catches up at the shelters. He stopped walking. Then we should wait for her. His limp was completely gone now. Wouldn't want her to miss us in this rain. I took a half step away, making it look like I was adjusting my pack. Actually, I just remembered she was meeting me at the next road crossing, taking a 0 day in town. No, he said quietly. You didn't remember that. You made it up, just like I made up this. He gestured to his leg, smiling slightly. It wasn't a kind smile. I ran. I like to say I thought it through, that I had some clever plan. But instinct took over. I shoved him hard to the left, where the ground sloped down, and ran uphill to the right. Behind me, I heard him curse and scramble up. No trace of a limp now. The rain made the rocks slick, but fear is a hell of a motivator. I crashed through Mountain Laurel, scratching my face, not daring to look back. His footsteps pounded behind me, getting closer. He was faster than me. Of course he was. He hadn't actually been hiking injured for the past hour. A branch whipped my face, drawing blood. I heard him laugh. Too close. My foot slipped on wet leaves, and I went down hard. As I scrambled up, my hand closed around a rock. He reached for my pack, and I swung around, rock ready. But someone else was there. 2 other hikers coming up the trail, poles clicking against rocks. He stopped so suddenly he nearly fell. You okay? One of the hikers called out. Heard running. Fine. I shouted back, not taking my eyes off him. Just startled a bear. He backed away slowly, that fake friendly smile returning. Good hiking with you, Shutterbug. Maybe I'll see you up trail. Then he turned and walked away, no sign of any limp. Moving faster than any injured hiker could. I reported it to the rangers, of course. Gave them his description. Told them about the changing limp, the inconsistent stories. They found some missing gear in a cave 2 miles away. Packs, sleeping bags, electronics. But they never found him. Sometimes I check the trail forums, looking for his description. Every few months, someone posts about a helpful stranger with a limp, always changing which leg is injured. The posts come from different trail sections, different states. Always remote areas. Always targeting solo hikers. I still hike, but never alone now. And I watch people's injuries carefully, how they favor the leg, how they handle the pain. Real injuries don't switch sides. Real injuries don't disappear when no one's watching. They say the trail provides. Sometimes it provides help when you need it most. But sometimes it provides warnings if you pay attention to the details. Like which leg someone limps with, or how their stories don't quite add up, or why they're so interested in whether you're hiking alone. Last I heard, gear was going missing along the long trail in Vermont. Hikers report a friendly guy with a limp helping them with their packs. The limp switches legs depending on who tells the story. If you're hiking alone and someone with an injury asks for help, watch carefully. Real pain isn't something you can switch on and off. Real hikers don't change their stories about where they started. And real help doesn't come with that predatory smile when they think no one else is watching.